Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make a couple of quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. The moon is almost full, so let's talk about this commander before he transforms. After 10 years, we finally received a compelling werewolf commander. Tovolar Dire Overlord is 3 mana, a 3/3, and he draws us cards whenever our wolves and werewolves bite an enemy player. Like all werewolves from the newest set, he's daybound, so the number of spells cast by a player on their turns will dictate whether he's on his front or back half. Note that this is distinct from original Innistrad werewolves, so some of them may transform at different intervals. However, Tovolar has a handy backup. When we control enough werewolves, he'll automatically force day into night, and he will transform any number of other leftover werewolves for us for free. And he's got an awesome mana sync ability on his back half as well. Tovolar is the Kessig Wolf runaway favorite from Midnight Hunt. He is 5 times more popular than the next most popular commander from that set, and he already has over 700 decks to his name. There are tons of commanders that have been around for 5 years that don't even have that many. Very, very impressive. Let's get right to it. We're going to take the average deck list from Tovolar's EDHREC page and plug it into the Architect deck building website. Remember that, as always, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall price of the deck. Players have clearly been waiting to pounce on a commander like this. I wouldn't be at all surprised if a lot of the early data surge we received for Tovolar is a result of many players taking their current Ulrich of the Krallen Horde deck lists and switching just a few new cards, including one very quick swap in the command zone. In many ways, this actually isn't a new commander deck at all. Let's take a quick moment to discuss some of the key cards in the deck. There's a smattering of useful staples that we would expect to see, from Heroic Intervention to Guardian Project to Herald's Horn. And happily, the werewolf-specific support pieces are all here. We don't have to go hunting for other special spells to help out the werewolves because they're already present. Full Moon's Rise is a classic, Howlpack Resurgence is splendid, and cards like Immerwolf keep our werewolves right where they should be. I'm also a fan of the new Celestis card, not to mention Moonmist. Importantly, this card doesn't transform all of our werewolves since some of them are daybound and nightbound, but it is still a one-sided fog effect, which can be a huge blowout when timed correctly. And of course, there are the werewolves themselves. Mayor of Averbuk oversees a very splendid population. Tovolar's Huntmaster is Grave Titan 2.0, and Duskwatch Recruiter is so good that it even shows up outside of werewolf tribal decks. This is a great starting point for a werewolf deck. So where can we make some upgrades? I'd like to tackle this list in the following 3 ways. Werewolf, Howl Oween, and on a more serious note, the Edric problem. Let's start with section 1. Upgrades? More like pupgrades, am I right? Because werewolf pups with the canine. Let's just stick to the cards. Starting off, there's a card I want to add into this deck ASAP. Tovolar draws us cards. There's a reason Reliquary Tower shows up in the mana base. Thought Vessel is slowly climbing back up in price, but get it now while you can. This is a very helpful mana rock for a commander that will overflow our hand just through the sheer advent of playing creatures. I have to admit, the next thing that I wanted to do was to add in the card Vivian Champion of the Wilds. The flash speed is historically very useful for werewolves, so we can avoid casting things on our own turn to force the change to night, but still use up our mana. But when playing this deck, I just found I didn't need it really at all. Tovolar handles the transformations for us. Relying on him to transform all of our stuff does make our plan a little commander-centric, but that is still pretty reliable, and certainly more reliable than trying to force flash in redundant places. On that note, though, there's a card in this deck you have to read very carefully. Return of the Wildspeaker. This card can pump up or draw us cards, and it's become a staple of the format for green decks. Note, though, that it only affects our non-human creatures. If our werewolves have not transformed, this card doesn't do anything. That's risky, but I will say I found it to be okay. Tovolar forces the transformation often enough that I didn't end up minding it. I could totally see it flopping for players in plenty of situations. It was okay for me, but it is a pretty temperamental card in this deck, so keep your eye on it. I've got another non-bow that I need to discuss too, and this will be an official cut. Ulvenwald Captive, let's talk. This is a werewolf horror, and as it turns out, that is a big problem for Tovolar. Tovolar only transforms human werewolves. He won't do anything to this one. If they're not a human werewolf, then we'd have to transform them manually, and they're not all worth that extra investment all the time. Ulvenwald Captive is a mana dork, which is nice, but it also has Defender, which our commander thoroughly dislikes, because he wants us attacking as much and as often as possible to draw more cards. I think we kick this one out of the pack to make room for better werewolves down the line. There's another pretty funny card in this list that I'm also going to remove, but I will do it with a bit of heaviness in my heart. Ancient Grudge is a fine card, but it seems to be here for flavor more than function. It depicts a werewolf, and as this famous flavor text has let us know, if there's anything a werewolf hates, it's a collar, the collar for Avacyn, the collar chosen specifically for the Church of Avacyn, Avacyn's collar. That collar? The meme value here is perfectly good reason to keep playing the card, but I'm personally going to opt out for a smidge more protection instead. This is a very creature-centric deck, and we don't have a ton of ways to protect our board right now. I've become a huge fan of the card Tybalt's Trickery. Counter a board wipe, sow a little chaos. This is a perfect inclusion for our Moonlight Madness. Alright, fun start, but let's continue the hunt in part 2. Upgrades to a werewolf deck? How'll we do it? Crushed it. In this section, I want to talk about cards that are dressed up as helpful cards, but that I don't think cut the mustard. They're not wolves in sheep's clothing, they're sheeps in wolves' clothing. Let's talk about Waxing Moon, Unnatural Moonrise, and Moonlight Hunt. These cards are perfectly on theme. I love that. However, I think they're lackluster. Moonlight Hunt is a removal spell that only works as long as we have a decent number of creatures in play. That is not ideal. I'd go as far as to say that it's in fact quite bad. Removal spells should also help us climb back into a game and get out of sticky situations, not only help us when we're already doing pretty well. Unnatural Moonrise I thought I would like, but I just never found it all that relevant. Our commander handles it just fine on his own just when we have enough creatures, which happens often enough that I didn't feel this was necessary. And as for Waxing Moon, I didn't expect to want to cut this one, but I was surprised to find how often I just didn't feel like I even wanted to play it. Granting Trample is cool, but a lot of our wolves are pretty low to the ground, so it's not always relevant, and more importantly, a bunch of our support cards and even fellow werewolves tend to give them that ability already. As for transforming an individual werewolf, that just never felt that impactful. It can't even transform some of our werewolf pack because some of them are daybound and nightbound. I bet we can find more powerful cards that will help us transform the whole team, not just one wolfie at a time. Up next, there's a pump effect here that I have to confess I am just not in love with. World, Unnatural Growth. Unnatural Growth, World. So I want to be clear, I think this is a great card. I just don't think it's as splendid in this specific deck. As a point in its favor, it's helpful at pumping up the team without us having to cast a spell to do it, which can help us out in the day-night cycle or to free up our mana for Tovolar's back half to use. But even though it was interesting, I didn't find it as impactful as I really wanted it to be. When Tovolar is giving us combat triggers whenever we actually land hits on other players, this was not the doubling effect that I was looking for. I much preferred Berserker's Onslaught, which already shows up in the average deck, because it gives double strike, netting us 2 hits and therefore 2 cards per strike. If we're gonna double our combat, I think we do it by doubling our hits, not just our stats. So in the interest of budget, and in the interest of doubling up our Tovolar synergy, I'd rather use Rage Reflection. 1 more mana, but it yields a ton more cards. And on that note, extra combats are just excellent in this deck. Relentless Assault is a cheap version of the extra combat effect, so that's the one we'll add, but keep your eyes peeled for other extra combat cards too. Some of them can be pretty pricey, so I'll mention a few of those later on in our honorable mentions section at the end of the video. But for now, get some extra combats in here and get some double striking along with it. Before I move to section 3, I'm going to spend a quick moment on the mana base. I found myself to actually be pretty okay with the low land count. Tovolar is pretty cheap to play, and his card draw abilities are very potent, so I found it to work out pretty alright. Definitely keep an eye on the low land count though, because this is lower than I would usually advise. I mostly want to talk about the mana base here because I'm interested in the lands themselves. Game Trail is lackluster to me personally, especially compared to the other options the deck already has. And as always, play within your budget. Heck, you could chop $50 off the prices of this deck just by losing the fetch land. In any case, I want to try out a few lands here that I think are potentially useful places to put excess mana. I was originally gonna go ham on the mana base so that our lands could be a space to put tons of mana so that when we skip casting spells to force the night cycle, we'd still have something to do. But once again, Tovolar just kinda handles that for us so beautifully already. So instead, I'm gonna opt to take out 2 kinda lackluster lands from the deck and add in these cheeky little guys. Draw something extra when our commander is transformed, give a small pump if we happen to have gone wide. I don't think we'll even use these all that often, but they are fun options to have. And the deck was dreadfully low on interesting utility lands, so I just wanted to fix that up. Alright, things are looking good, but in every hunt, there's a moment of dread. And that's definitely the case with our 3rd section. Alright, no terrible puns this time. Let's get serious. Here is an awkward truth. Tovolar might be more powerful as a wolf tribal deck than as a werewolf tribal deck. I'm not making a value judgment about that. I'm just laying out that there's something kind of strange going on here with the particular makeup of this commander's abilities. Tovolar's ability is strongly reminiscent of commanders like Toski or Edric. When our creatures hit, we draw cards. And when a commander has when you do X, draw cards ability, we've always been able to see a pattern emerge over time, that things get streamlined and honed down to proc that card draw trigger as much and as often as possible. We've seen it with Arcades, who forgoes cool 4-mana walls in favor of just random 1-mana walls because they're just so efficient. We've even seen it with Angie Falconwrath, who doesn't care what the madness card is that she's discarding, she just wants to cycle through her deck so super fast. Heck, it's even famous in Edgar, who is just so speedy and aggressive that over time, he's begun to favor random 1-drop vampires over any bulky 7-drop vampires. And of course, we've seen it with Edric. While Edric, once upon a time, may have been intended as a political commander, the reality of him is that his deck is just full of random, tiny, 1-mana creatures just to dig and dig and dig as fast as possible. While there are certainly Edric players out there who just want to do fun political shenanigans rather than optimize the commander within an inch of its life and lose the deck's thematicism, there's no denying that that type of Edric deck is vastly in the minority. I worry that this is also potentially a fate that awaits Tovolar. When a 4-mana creature would draw you 1 card, but a 1-mana wolf would also draw you 1 card, one of those deals starts to look more appealing than the other. The more 1 and 2 drops we've got, the faster we can draw cards, which will get us more cheap critters into our hand, which will draw us more cards, which just gets us snowballing way more efficiently. Since Tovolar cares about wolves as well as werewolves, players may find that they actually can hone the deck down and get more mileage out of teeny wolves instead of big fun werewolves. Classic Edric problem. In fact, cards like Toski or Orin Frostfang start to get appealing in that type of deck too, even though they aren't wolves or werewolves, because they just lean right into that more prominent attack trigger focus, which, if efficient enough, could eclipse the werewolf theme. But now that we've established all of that, I want to be perfectly frank with you. I don't want to build a deck that way. Not really interested. This is upping the average, not optimizing the average. The appeal of Tovolar, to me, is the werewolves. I don't mind the occasional wolf helper here and there, and in fact I'll add a few in a second, but I'm not here for a wolf tribal commander, I'm here for a werewolf tribal commander. I'm here to watch Cult of the Waxing Moon make a ton of tokens when stuff transforms. I'd like to preserve that identity in this deck. Just keep a very careful eye on Tovolar's data, because some number of Tovolar decks might go the optimization route, and others might prefer the thematicism. For our purposes here, we're going to try and avoid the Edric problem. So, now let's talk about those werewolves. Ironically, after saying all that, I am taking out 1 more werewolf from the deck. Daybreak Ranger did not impress me. It is a 3-mana 2/2 that is a 4/4 on the other side. That is true of several common werewolves. And even though this one has a fight ability, we're here to attack with our werewolves. I didn't like it. The fight ability just wasn't that appealing. I'm gonna exchange this one out. So, which wolves am I adding? Well, I am going to add 2 cheap ones first. Masked Vandal and Young Wolf. Don't worry, I promise we are not falling into the Edric problem, but these cards have their merits. Young Wolf sticks around plain and simple. It's not huge, but I mean, come on, this deck is already playing Reckless Wave. Young Wolf rounds out our low end of the curve, helps Tovolar transform, and it sticks around 1 more time if needed. It's not glamorous, but it is weirdly effective. As for Masked Vandal, this one is good whether we play it turn 2 and get drawing with Tovolar right away, or if we draw it late game and need to get rid of something really nasty, such as a collar that is the shape of Avacyn's symbol, the symbol of Avacyn's church. In any case, it's very nice. So, there's 1 more card to add, and looking over all the werewolves we've got, I think all the important bases are covered. This is one stacked pack. So who's the final wolf to join in then? Just a simple uncommon that's kinda gotten buried by the data a little bit. My eyes glazed over it a few times, but when I finally gave Fangblade Brigand a shot, I really liked it. We've got moments here where we can pull off a really go-wide attack. Heck, that's why Beastmaster Ascension is in this deck after all. It lets us attack freely but still keep up mana to do something else extra mid-combat. However, in those go-wide moments, Tovolar's Kessig Wolfrun-esque ability sometimes gets funky. It's still probably the most common place that we'll want to put our mana for our literal alpha strike, but sometimes the math works out where we'd rather pump up a board of double-striking werewolves rather than 1 single attacker. Plus, having access to multiple types of combat abilities makes combat basically impossible for our opponents to deal with optimally. No matter what they try to do, the threat of activation on both of these abilities has our bases completely covered. It's kind of funny that the last few additions to the deck were little commons and uncommons, but I think that's a testament to how good this setup already was. And besides, these uncommons are the thing that makes us love to play Werewolves in the first place. Let's round things out with some quick, honorable mentions. If you're not looking to spend a huge buck on this deck, what's a more budget-friendly version gonna look like? Well, Beastmaster Ascension and Triumph of the Hordes are each over 10 bucks, but they can swap out for any old thing. Overwhelming Stampede just straight up wins games, and Overrun is sincerely no slouch either. Rhythm of the Wild can swap directly across for a Fires of Yavimaya too. $8 uncommon? That's crazy pants. If we want haste, Fires costs a quarter. The Planeswalkers are also fun, but they can be a little extra, so if you want a cheap way to make a bunch of tokens, try out a Wolfcaller's Howl. Also, if you don't mind a slight deviation from theme, Rurik Thar is very cheap to acquire, and he's very, very effective at deterring enemies from casting too many spells and turning things to daytime. On the flip side, what about the opposite end of the spectrum? What's a good direction to look when upgrading the deck even more? Well, Master of the Wild Hunt is the first card I'd be interested in, and Metallic Mimic right behind it. Efficient token creation, and a cheap werewolf that pumps up our others. To make room for these, I think I was least enamored by Lamholt Elder and Hermit of the Natternolls in the Creature Suite, so those might be my proposed swap-outs. I also have to give my love to Savage Beating and many other extra combat cards. These just never fail to impress. They pull off surprise wins out of seemingly nowhere. I think I'd probably consider taking out the Silverfur Partisan and the Herald's Horn to make room for extra combat spells. Tough call, but they have notable fail states, while extra combats are just absolutely devastating plays. However, the most important addition I'd want to make to this deck is Mutavault. Changeling land? Amazing. I'd frankly also consider Faceless Haven, which would of course mean swapping for snow basics. But free werewolves in the mana base? You'll love to see it. Alright, this has been far too much activity, and it's almost turned to daytime, so let's wrap it up. Here is our final list, which you can find in the description box below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you enjoyed your hunt with Tovolar, because I am positive that he enjoyed his hunt with you too. I need to be stopped. Anyway, if you have any other recommendations for cards that you think your fellow Wolfpack ought to be playing in their decks too, make sure you sound off below, and as always, thanks so much for watching.